Yeah, so again, we're going to be going over my new book, The Crystal Lattice Mind Illusion, and it's already out on Amazon, or you can find it on my website at esotericeddie.com. And you can also find the free documentary version on my YouTube at Esoteric Eddie TV. But yeah, I got a full-on presentation, a lot of information, so we're going to be going through a lot of dense stuff, so I'll try my best to explain everything with the time that we have. But yeah, I'm ready to rock if you guys are.
Yeah, no, you take your time. You take us on this journey as you see fit, man. It's a really good book, and it covers so much. It's spanning. It's an odyssey. So let's see. What happened to your presentation?
Whoa!
It's like the Matrix is like setting itself or something.
Cool. So, can you guys see it now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah.
All right, let me just do a quick test here. Slideshow, play from start. All right.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay.
Yeah, we see it now.
Cool. All right. Let's get into it. And Miguel or Vance, just let me know if you want me to close the screen for whatever reason.
No, good, man. Sure.
Okay, cool. Let's get into it. So, the crystal lattice mind illusion. We're going to be diving into consciousness, the subconscious, archetypes, the matrix, and the suppression of consciousness and how we can break out of this program. So I start the book off and the presentation with a quote from Carl Jung. And the quote is, as I read here verbatim, "The word archetype is thoroughly characteristic of the structural forms that underlie consciousness, as the crystal lattice underlies the crystallization process." So in other words, what Carl Jung was saying was, just like our physical world is actually comprised of smaller structures at the microcosm level, our entire reality, our mind, our consciousness is also comprised of smaller parts, codes, if you will. And that's important to understand as we go through this presentation. And this quote pretty much sums up the entire book if you understand it with everything else that comes with it. So let's break apart the mind illusion part first, and of the crystal lattice mind illusion. So we have two major parts of ourselves, right? The mind and body connection. Actually, real quick, I'm going to just pause. I'm going to see if I can share the screen while we can see us as well.
Yeah, the audience can see us.
That's how it was.
Yeah.
You may not have, but yeah, they could see our faces on the left.
Interesting.
So now you got to just add it again, or let me know, and I can change the format. I can make it just the screen. I can make it.
Oh, okay, because on my end, I can just see the presentation, but as long as you guys can see everybody else, I'm cool with that.
Oh, yeah, we're cool.
We see our faces on the left, so all good, man.
Cool. All right, so going back to this. So we have two major parts of ourselves, right? We have the body and the mind. But even those two major parts have smaller components. Most people walk around thinking that they're just one unit. They're just a body. I'm Eddie. I'm just a person, whatever. But the truth is, even that is false, because the body is made up of billions of parts, if you want to count all the cells. And if you don't even want to count the cells, we're still made up of all these different moving parts and organs and whatnot. So even the body alone is made up of a whole different lattices and structures. And the mind itself, as we see through this presentation, also has different facets to it. The mind isn't just one unit as well. And so with the mind and body connection, we have what is called central reality, or what I call central reality. And central reality is malleable. It can change. Central reality is controlled by basically the global institutions that govern our world. So the mainstream narrative that we are told, that we are dictated by the global institutions, is what central reality is. And that can change, and it has changed. But whoever controls that basically controls the world, because we live in reality tunnels. So whatever narrative we're told and whatever that is, the mass is going to ultimately believe, and that's ultimately what our reality is going to be based off of. And with the central reality, which we interface through our consciousness, we have the collective subpsyche, as I call it, or the collective subconscious, or collective unconscious, as Jung would call it. And with the collective subpsyche, we all interface through our subconscious. just as we all have an individual conscious and an individual subconscious, we also have a collective conscious and a collective subconscious. And in the collective subconscious is where really weird things can happen, because in the collective subconscious is where all these nightmares and dreams and fantasies and fetishes reside that I believe can actually gain a self-awareness, a sort of etherical AI, if you will, an egregore. And Jung believed this as well. And an example of this would be the miracle of Fatima. So this was an event that took place in Portugal back in the early 1900s. And what happened is 3 young kids in Portugal claimed to have been visited by the Virgin Mary. And for 3 days, she prophesied to them. And I believe one of the last prophecies is still yet to be fulfilled. And after those 3 days of these kids having been visited by the Virgin Mary, in 1917, 70,000 people in Portugal witnessed what they said was the sun dancing around in the sky and zigzagging back and forth like to earth and back up into the sky. So to me and to Jung, this would be an example of the collective subpsyche breaking through into the collective conscious, the central reality. And this is possible in a group setting, and this is possible in an individual setting. And UFOs could be another example of this. Jung has a book that I love. It's titled Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies. And he breaks down UFOs and what they might be from a psychoanalytical standpoint. And he believed that the modern occurrence of UFOs all began with the stresses of the world wars, World War I and II. And during these during these times, as the world was in war and an apocalypse, there was a lot of subconscious struggle. The world was seeing things they had never seen before at that time. So everybody was basically anticipating the end of the world, anticipating some Messiah to be seen in the skies. And so this collective subpsyche distress was so powerful that it had to break through and project itself into the conscious world to come through, to send a message and tell us, that there's something going on in our deeper program that needs attention. And Jung believed that distress is what caused these UFOs to emanate and project forward. In other words, they were sort of hallucinations. And he also breaks down that the reason we saw them in the way that we did, being circular shapes, is because the circle has played an integral part in our subconscious for thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. The circle has always represented something divine. And he uses the mandala as an example of that. A mandala being an ancient circular sacred geometric symbol that represents, protection and divinity. And so the circle has always represented the unfathomable, the divinity that has no beginning and no end. So again, Jung believed that the UFOs that we were seeing from, the World War I and II and onward were basically projected from the collective subpsyche because of the amount of distress worldwide that we were all experiencing at once. And that doesn't mean they're not real. It can mean that we are maybe calling them in from some other dimension through our subpsyche, or it could mean that, they started off as thoughts and egregores, but have now gained self-awareness and are being empowered through the energy that we feed them. It's a whole other topic, but the point being is that the collective subpsyche has enough power to project things into our conscious world.
I don't even want to think about the cigars. The cigar-shaped UFOs.
Yeah, he's got a whole section of it in the book where he talks about the cigars being influenced from, the phallic idea.
Yeah, I figured.
Yeah.
The collective. Yeah, or the collective Lewinsky. Maybe call it
Yeah.
that.
Oh, man. So, and archetypes, right? So archetypes are a part of that quote that I read in the beginning. And to Jung, archetypes were kind of like codes in a sense. And he believed that when we were born, whenever we're born or conceived, that we get a download of reality. And in that download of reality is the program of this reality. And in that program comes equipped the archetypes. not just the major arcana, but also just the regular archetypes of what a tree is, what a bird is, what the ocean is. And as we see in this quote here on the screen from Jung, he believed, as I say here, the form of the world into which a person is born is already inborn in him as a virtual image. So in other words, as he was saying in that quote in the beginning, archetypes or all these physical objects that are around us are just downloaded programs, for us to experience. And this is, again, important to keep in mind as we go through this. And so to Jung, anything was an archetype, a tree, us even, and they were just codes embedded into the reality program. But of course, we have the major archetypes like a UFO. Again, a UFO is a major archetype. And as we go through distresses or certain existential crises, certain archetypes show up in our life. In ancient times, the archetype could have been, again, like the Virgin Mary or Jesus or an angel or something. As the subconscious goes through distress, it can project an archetype. And that's the reason being is because the subconscious is very powerful, and the subconscious is where the program resides. And Jung spoke about this again, saying that the subconscious is so powerful that, as I say in this quote, modern man still does not realize that he is entirely dependent on the cooperation of the unconscious, which can actually cut short the very next sentence he proposes to speak. He is unaware that he is continuously sustained by something, while all the time he regards himself exclusively as the doer. So again, we have two parts of the mind, two major parts of the mind, the conscious and the unconscious, or the conscious and the subconscious. And in the subconscious is where the program resides. It's where the archetypes reside. It's where the reality tunnels are formulated first. And the subconscious is what I call the higher self. I think it is the self that is most connected to God. And I think that because the subconscious, as Jung just said in the previous quote, is the most liberated and free part of us. Our conscious mind depends on the subconscious. And the conscious program is dependent on the subconscious program. Or in other words, the conscious reality is dependent on the subconscious program. And archetypes, to me, in my definition, are projected into our reality when the human mind is triggered by cultural parameters equating to a figure or phenomenon. Example, darkness is scary, scary is evil, and the devil is the evilest being. Therefore, the devil is seen in the dark. This is an example of the sequence of how reality tunnels are formed. Again, by archetypes, by codes, by narratives that we are indoctrinated into. And again, the program of our reality starts in the subconscious, and we know this because in a simple example, it's difficult for us to change our habits. If it was easy for us to eat better or work out more or do whatever it is that we want to do, or stop doing what it is that we want to do, we would just do it. We would all be living our highest self. But it's not that easy. And it's not that easy because the program resides in the subconscious. So in order to change our lives, we need to go to the deepest parts of ourselves, the subconscious, the higher self, and rewire and change the program. And with that, we are a spiritual machine. We have the mind and the body. And again, even both of those major parts have smaller parts. And together we are a spiritual machine, and we should be operating harmoniously so that we can ascend into higher forms and have more capabilities in this life, as I'll explain later on. The brain is simply the VR headset that we use to toggle into this reality. What we actually are is consciousness. The brain is one part of us here, but it's more so the tool, the machine that we use to toggle here in this program.
Yeah, well said.
All right, so that was the mind illusion part of it. Now, the crystal lattice part of it, right? Or actually, before I go on, the mind illusion part of it, again, is the fact that we're not just a body, and we're not even just a mind right now. That's what we are ultimately, but right now we're the body and the mind. And the illusion part of it is that most of us just believe that we're just one unit. And again, that is not even true. The body's made up of hundreds of units at the very least. All right, so the crystal lattice part of it. Now, a lattice, in short, is basically the smallest structure in a physical object. Whether it be an atom, it's the smallest structure made up of atoms. So, for example, in a crystal, the lattice would be like a cube made up of, for example, 4 different atoms or 4 different particles. So that's what a lattice is. The lattice is the smallest unit structure in a physical object. And so that could look like a cube. It could look like a triangle, whatever. But then the lattice structure is the fractalization of that smallest unit. So when you take that smallest unit and then multiply it and fractalize it, then it grows into what its final form is going to be, whether it's the physical crystal you hold in your hand or whether it's a human cell growing and fractalizing outward into a human body. So that's what a lattice is. And our entire reality, our entire physical world runs off of lattices. It runs off of smaller units that fractalize outward into bigger macrocosmic forms. And these lattices are codes, and they're runoff codes. They're runoff equations. And that's again apparent in the fractalized nature that we see around us. And in these fractalized equations around us is embedded, math is embedded in it. Math is basically the language of the universe. And so all around us are equations, numbers, and geometries. And these equations, numbers, and geometries are the codes, the lattices that our reality program runs off of. And this is apparent in the Fibonacci sequence. And again, the Fibonacci sequence was produced by Leonardo Fibonacci in his book Liber Abacus. And in that book, he pretty much just posed this pretty cool math equation. And from that math equation, we got the Fibonacci sequence, which is basically a set of numbers which are the summation of the previous 2 numbers. And out of that equation, we realized something interesting. That sequence of numbers, I think it starts off like 0, 0, 1, 3, 5, and then onward. That sequence is actually in nature. We see it in nature around us. And when we take that sequence and input it into a program, a growth program, we get these beautiful fractalized patterns that we see all around us in flower petals, in conch shells, in hurricanes, in universal spirals, right. And even the human fetus. The human fetus starts off as a little spiral. So the Fibonacci sequence was kind of a miraculous find. We realized that nature runs off of a similar code that produces these fractalized patterns. And that's also apparent in the golden ratio. The golden ratio, 1.618, is the ratio that the Fibonacci numbers harmonize to. And so the golden ratio can also be used to create very symmetrical and beautiful patterns. And we found that whoever designed us was using the golden ratio, in our limbs, in our body follows a very strict ratio and sequence and code. And so again, these codes, these equations are seen all around us in nature. Nature looks chaotic. It looks as if it's flowing and as if it's random. But that's the beautiful illusion of it. When you actually look at it, examine it, you find that all of nature is running off of lattices, equations, and codes, very specifically set. And another example of that would be the birthing process. It takes approximately, give or take, 9 months for a human to be born. And we start off as a little circular egg, and that little circular egg splits off and becomes eventually what we are. And so, again, that's just another example how in nature there are strict equations, strict set codes. The fact that it takes exactly 9 months, give or take, for us to be born should tell you that, we were designed this way. Something designed the code to run this way. And with that, we have DNA, right? DNA and cells, which would be the smallest unit structures of what a human is. And for hundreds of years, scientists believe that DNA was what caused cells to form. But we now know, or we are now at least challenging that and saying that maybe it's not that way. And one of the people who challenged that was Rupert Sheldrake. So Rupert Sheldrake basically just realized that DNA comes equipped in the cell. So he realized that DNA is already equipped in the cell. So how can DNA be making the cell if it becomes a part of the package?
Right.
So DNA simply activates or deactivates certain traits that the cell will carry on. But DNA is not the actual originator or creator of cells. And so Rupert Sheldrake came up with his own theory of morphogenetic fields. And he believed that there was an invisible field that was actually resonating cells into existence. And this isn't far-fetched. There are fields around us that we accept exist that we can't see. For example, the electromagnetic field. We know it's there, but we can't see it. And the same thing with Wi-Fi and all kinds of other things that we know exist, but we can't see. So he believed there was a field, the morphogenetic field, that was actually responsible for life buzzing and resonating into existence. And he likened that to cymatics, right? Cymatics is the science of putting water or sand on a sound plate and hitting it with certain frequencies. And as it gets hit with certain frequencies, the water or the sand forms into a beautiful geometric pattern. And every frequency causes it to shape into a different form. So he believed that the morphogenetic fields of resonance could beam or buzz in different types of life forms, different types of cells through its various resonating fields. And that's going to be important to keep in mind as we go through this. Again, so we have the physical world, but as we start to examine it at the quantum level, it gets less and less physical, and it appears as if the whole entire physical world around us is buzzing in from a seemingly nothingness. Everything is coming out of nothing, but that nothingness, as we'll see, is actually the infinity, the higher dimension. And so with the DNA and cells and the biological life, we have the four fundamental forces of nature, as mainstream science puts it forth. The four fundamental forces of nature are the electromagnetic force, responsible for those two, of course. And then we have the strong and nuclear force. The strong nuclear force is what holds things together. It's what holds atoms and particles together. And then we have the weak nuclear force, which basically allows for decay or for particles to transition, which gives us emissions or exhaust, change. And we have gravity, which is still theoretical. We haven't been able to detect gravity, a gravity wave. We've only been able to detect its effects. But nonetheless, we have gravity. And gravity is just not just about, things being heavier than others. Gravity is what causes everything to move. Gravity sets the clockwork of our universe in motion, which is important because with the motion of the celestial objects, whether we're on a flat earth or not, whether you believe that or not, the celestial objects are still moving. And because they move, we have seasons. And because we have seasons, we have circadian rhythms in our bodies. And circadian rhythms, they influence our sleeping patterns, which influence our waking and sleeping consciousness. So gravity is responsible for the clockwork of nature. And with those four forces, we have the hypothetical fifth force that scientists have been looking for close to 200 years. They believe that there's a fifth force that unites them all, that stretches in between all of them, that could be used as an internet or a fuel source if we were able to find it. And some scientists believe they have found it over the years. An example of that would be the X-17 particle that was found recently, I think a year or two ago, by a particle accelerating laboratory in Hungary known as Atomkai. And they believe that this X-17 particle, which was invisible to us before they had found it, is responsible for dark matter and maybe the fifth force and stuff like that. And that's also what the guys and gals at CERN have been trying to do as well, is trying to find that underlying fifth force, that underlying force that unifies all things throughout the universe. And as we'll go through this presentation, we'll start to realize that fifth force might actually be consciousness. Now, Karl Pribram who was a brain scientist, a neuroscientist with over 200 publications and several books on the anatomy of the body, the brain, and the mind, started off thinking that the mind was produced by the brain, but later on, towards the end of his career, realized that the mind was antecedent or was precedent to the brain. In other words, the mind was separate from the brain. Mm-hmm. And he realized that and also wrote it into his theory known as the holonomic brain theory. And basically, he realized after studying holograms and how they work that our brain and mind work in a similar way that holograms do. And holograms basically work through a set of mirrors, lasers, and photosensitive plates. And when the photosensitive plate is hit with a laser, the hologram is projected. And so he believed that our reality worked in the same way. And in the analogy, basically, our brain is the photosensitive plate holding all the information, and our mind is the laser. And when our mind hits the brain, or when our consciousness gets input into the brain from wherever it comes from, then our reality is projected. That's how this is kind of working. That's what he concluded. So that's pretty much the crystal lattice mind illusion before we get into some of the deeper aspects of it. And the definition that I have for it in my book is that it is the concept that reality is comprised of the physical and non-physical working in conjunction to construct our universe. The crystal lattice part of it is the fact that both the physical and non-physical operate from code system. The mind illusion aspect has to do with the conflict of neglecting to realize that we are more than just the physical. That is the crystal lattice mind illusion. Now let's dig into ancient cosmologies for a bit. What did the ancestors think about the universe and how we were created? So the Enuma Elish, coming from the Sumerians, tells us that in the beginning, Apsu and Tiamat created the elemental gods through having their waters mingle. So we're told that their waters mingled, which is important to keep in mind. And we're also told that at that time, nothing had been named yet, which is also important to keep in mind. In the Egyptian text, we're told that in the beginning, there was a watery darkness, and that the first self-created being, Atum, created the elemental gods in the physical world by speaking with the Nun, who was the watery darkness. And in the Rig Veda, the Hindu cosmology, we are told that in the beginning there was a cosmic water. And through the cosmic water sprang forth the eternal one, the original consciousness. And also in Hinduism, we're also told that the Om is the vibration that sustains all physical universe. And in the Torah, all three of these are reflected when we're told that God, the Ruach, whatever that may be, was floating above the waters. So again, we see these waters in the beginning. And we're also told that God brought forth physical life through word. Again, as he said, let there be light. So in all of those, we have three key similarities. We have a watery darkness, a self-created consciousness, a God, and we have life being spoken into existence. And all three of those are what I call the cosmic ether, that watery darkness, who was the mother of all ethers, the mother of all waves. And we have the creator consciousness, God, if you will, who created all the other consciousnesses that exist in the world or in the universe. And we have what I call the Om vibration. The creator consciousness with the cosmic ether created the physical world, the material world, through vibration, through speaking, as we're told by the ancestors. And this is corroborated in quantum physics. Quantum physics tells us that everything is made up of vibrating particles. So our physical world, the entire physicality of our universe, is sustained by vibrations. And words are nothing more than vibrations. They're frequencies. And when our Creator created us and everything, it had the power of manifestation at will. It could take imagination and word, which is frequency, and create at will. And we have a microcosmic version of that. We all have an imagination, we all have word, and we can bring our imaginations into fruition, into existence, not at will like our God can, like the Creator can, but we still have a microcosmic version of that. And so altogether, those three components were what I call the ancient matrix, the first three components that were the building blocks for everything else that came afterward. And with that, Plato was, I guess, one of the first to realize that we are living in a simulation. He believed that everything around us were emanations, projections from some source reality. He believed that this reality was a facsimile reality, a false reality, a shadow reality, and that everything, including us, is being projected from what he called the essence, some mainframe, some source, some infinity. And this is also apparent or reflected in his cave analogy or his cave allegory, which I'm sure you're all familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so consciousness, right? So now we're starting to realize that, we're not just a body, that there is something more to consciousness. And A.C. Bhaktivedanta, who was a prolific Swami and writer, wrote about consciousness and reincarnation in his book, Coming Back to Life. And in that book, he tells us that there are different kingdoms of consciousness. There are differing levels of consciousness. There is the plant kingdom, there is the animal kingdom, and the human kingdom. And he believed that the human consciousness was the highest form of consciousness as of now, and that it was, a part of those kingdoms, and that it is our responsibility, because of that, to take the consciousness that we have and curate it and elevate it to an even higher form. We have a privilege and a responsibility in the human consciousness that we have. And as we see in the quote on the screen here, he believed that it was our right and our responsibility to do so. And so consciousness has differing levels to it in itself, and not to say that animals or insects aren't conscious. I think they are, but I think they just have a different level of it. And some of them are actually starting to exhibit higher levels of consciousness. Some of them are evolving as well. And I think it was our Creator's plan to ultimately have us be upgraded. I think it was always in the Creator's plan for us to slowly be upgraded to the point where we would be able to receive in full who we are and what it is. And with the differing levels of consciousness, we have the lower forms, which I call static thinking and autonomic thinking. And we experience this in our day-to-day life. When you're zoned out, that's you operating from autonomic thinking, from static thinking. And our ancestors, our hominid ancestors, I believe, weren't always conscious in the way that we are. And anthropologists would agree with this as well. And again, I think that's because our Creator had it in its plan for us to slowly evolve to the point, and not really evolve, but upgrade more so. Because as we see through studying evolution, consciousness was an enigma. It wasn't created because of evolution. The body went through evolution, but the mind was almost like just input randomly into us, it seems. And some pieces of evidence of that would be the fact that our modern skeletal system, that of the Homo sapiens sapiens, which is what we are now, is only about 100,000 years old. So the human being that we are today, the Homo sapiens sapiens, as they call us, is only about 100,000 years old. Prior to that, we were a whole different creature. But the consciousness that we have today, that we're familiar with, is only about 50,000 years old, according to anthropologists. And so somewhere, something happened that caused us to think in this abstract and self-aware way that we have. And most anthropologists would say that was due to language. They believe that language, and metaphorical language, is what caused our consciousness to shift into the way that it is now. And Terence McKenna would agree with that in his stoned ape theory,
Right.
which states that our ancestors were eating psychedelic mushrooms, and through that they created languages and metaphors and abstract thinking. So both him and the anthropologists agree on that point. But nonetheless, something happened that interjected the consciousness into the Homo sapien body and made us become self-aware. We were turned on by something or someone. And Alfred Wallace, who was the co-founder of the theory of natural selection, and who also was a colleague and friend of Charles Darwin, who helped him come up with the theory of Darwinism, later renounced his beliefs in the theory of evolution and believed that the theory of evolution could not account for how abstract and unique the human mind is. And he wrote about this in a lot of letters that we have available to us today. And in one of those letters, he said, as I quote, "I know that non-human intelligences exist, that there are minds disconnected from a physical brain, that there is therefore a spiritual world. This is not, for me, a belief merely, but knowledge founded on the long continued observation of facts," so on and so forth. So he was an interesting guy. He was actually attending a lot of seance parties towards the end of the 1800s.
Oh, wow.
Which were very popular at that time. A lot of people like to get together and try to summon spirits and play the Ouija board and stuff like that. And so he was attending a lot of these, and he witnessed, as he writes in some of his letters, tables levitating, spirits emanating forth from nowhere, people mediating spirits and talking in tongues and stuff like that. So because of these experiences, he concluded that the mind was way more powerful than scientists thought. It was way more powerful, and it was coming from a whole different dimension. And the brain and evolution was not producing the mind. It was probably the other way around. And in this quote on the screen, he basically says, he was basically rejecting the idea that the brain produces the mind. Because to him, as he says in this quote on the screen, if one molecule can't produce consciousness, then what difference does it make if you add 10,000 more molecules to that one molecule? It's not going to produce consciousness. So in other words, the brain is just a tool that is used by consciousness. It's not producing consciousness. And so with that, we have the mainstream theories of consciousness. And in my research, I found that there are 4 major theories out there right now. And I'm not going to go into major detail as to what they are, but you can see on the screen, these are the names of the 4 mainstream theories. And all of them, as I write in my book, pretty much say the same thing. They say that that we are all robots, that the brain takes a multitude of senses that it is processing simultaneously and collects them. And that collection of simultaneous stimuli is then projected as the illusion of consciousness, the illusion of a 360 experience. That's what they believe. But we all know that's not true. We know that's inherently not true because we have a unique self that we experience. And these mainstream theories of consciousness, they only explain how autonomic thinking works, how static thinking works, the thinking of a bug. They don't explain why or how we have such an abstract, individual, unique self. And with that, we have all kinds of new theories about our reality and our mind that have been coming out. And one of those is the triadic dimensional vortical paradigm theory that was put together by Vernon Knepp, who's actually the leading scientist on deja vu, and Ed Close. And they presented this in 2011, and they had been working on it for at least a decade, probably more. And what they realized was that the Einsteinian model of our physical world was no longer relevant. It could not explain all of the phenomena in our universe, in our reality, specifically stuff that was happening at the quantum level. And they came up with at least 49 conundrums that could not be explained by the Einsteinian model anymore. And one of those is the Cabibbo angle. And I'm not a scientist, so I had to read a lot of thick papers and all kinds of things to barely begin to wrap my head around what these guys were saying. And the Cabibbo angle is one of the conundrums that I could fairly understand. And basically the Cabibbo angle or anomaly is this phenomena of particles phasing in and out of existence. So particles, again, they vibrate, but they also phase in and out of existence. So how could that be? How could we be here, but the very most fundamental lattice of us be phasing in and out of existence? And so they went back to the drawing board and they scrapped all the known theories and rewrote them all so that they could make sense with what we know now. And they concluded that we live in 9 dimensions. That we live in 9 dimensions, but those 9 dimensions are encased in an infinite dimension. And they also concluded that all of those dimensions are interconnected to the infinite dimension by what they called the Gimel. I don't know why they called it that, but they called it the Gimel.
That's a Hebrew letter.
What's that?
Gimel is a Hebrew letter, so maybe
is it 9? Is that what it is?
I don't know.
Maybe it stands for 9 or something.
I'll look it up.
Yeah.
But they realized that the Gimel, that interconnected force,
third level of the Hebrew alphabet.
But the Gimel, they realized is consciousness. They concluded that consciousness is what interconnects all the dimensions to the infinite dimension. And so consciousness has been deemed as the hard problem by physicists and quantum physicists. And this term was created by the now famous philosopher David Chalmers. And he stated this in a famous speech at a conference of consciousness in Tucson, Arizona, back in 1994, the year that I was born, actually, strange enough. But he stated that, basically what he said is that it's the easy thing, or explaining how the brain reacts to stimuli is easy. That's easy. But the hard problem is explaining why the brain would need consciousness, why the brain would need a self-abstract identity. The hard problem is explaining why evolution or the brain would need consciousness. And so he was basically stating that, the brain doesn't produce consciousness. We've now come to the point where we're shifting the focus. We don't really, the evolution and these Einsteinian models don't work anymore. Consciousness is much more fascinating, much more powerful than we used to think. And so we have the 2 minds, as I've been stating, right? We have the 2 major parts of us, the body and the mind, but the mind itself has 2 parts, the conscious and subconscious, which plays an integral role in how we interface into this program, how we're suppressed in the program, and how we can ascend the program. And there's been a new theory that has come out recently last year on the subconscious, which I call the deja vu theory. I don't know what the actual theory is. I don't know if they have one yet, but it was led by scientist Andrew Budson. And in this theory of the subconscious, Andrew Budson states that basically everything that we do, every action that we perform in our conscious life is actually dictated and thought of first by our subconscious mind, like faster than the speed of light. So in other words, our conscious actions and life is kind of a puppet being wielded by our subconscious. So basically all of life is kind of like a deja vu moment that is being acted out from the subconscious. And he also goes to say in this quote on the screen what I stated earlier, that the subconscious is where the program resides. And that's why it's difficult to change our lives, because we're relying on our conscious self when we need to be going deeper into our subconscious self and reconnecting to our highest self in order to change our reality tunnels. And the subconscious mind used to play a much more, integral role. It used to play a much more, just much more a crucial role in our day-to-day life back in our primal years. And this is seen in the fact that we have an internal dialogue or an inner dialogue. And what's interesting is that only half of the population has an inner dialogue.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, it's very weird, very strange. So apparently only half of us actually hear our voice in our head. So I have one. I have a voice in my head, sometimes multiple, but not everybody thinks in that way, which is strange. And the inner dialogue, the the study of the inner dialogue kind of started in the 1930s with Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky. And he realized that we had the inner dialogue. Well, he knew we had the inner dialogue, but he realized that it probably played a much more important role, back in our development as humans, because he realized that children, they utilize their inner dialogue much more than we do externally. If you watch kids, you realize that they speak to themselves and they say what they're going to do. Like, I'm going to walk over here. I'm doing this or whatever. They speak their inner dialogue outward. And as we grow, it kind of just suppresses and just goes back inward. So we have this inner dialogue, but only about half of us have it. So that tells us that, it was probably a part of something bigger, in our early development as humans. And another person who believed that was Julian Jaynes. And Julian Jaynes came up with the bicameral mind theory. And so the bicameral mind theory states that this inner dialogue, which is very faint in our human functions these days, used to be much more integral. He believed that this inner dialogue actually used to be very, very vocal and prominent, thousands of years ago, and that we actually used to hear a full-on other voice in our head speaking to us, and that our ancestors perceived this other voice to be either the voice of God, the gods, or dead relatives, or some spirit, and that it was common and normal for us to have these two voices in our head. And he believed that that's what the gods were, or this other voice in our mind. And what's interesting is that most functions in our body, like sight and smell and taste, all have a counterpart in the other hemisphere. So we have two hemispheres, and each function has a counterpart in each hemisphere. But interestingly, the function of language is only active in one hemisphere. We have another part in the opposing hemisphere, but it's deactivated. And we now know that in schizophrenics' brains, both of those components are activated. And that's why they hear the voices more prominently. And so that tells us that this inner dialogue, this voice of the subconscious, used to be much more prominent and slowly faded out for some reason, or was discontinued in the newer models of human beings. And so that can mean a lot of things. It can mean that maybe we used to commune directly with our Creator, with God, with the other dimensions. And Julian Jaynes believed, like the anthropologist and Terence McKenna, that our minds changed when our language changed. He believed, as is stated in this quote on the screen, language is an organ of perception, not simply a means of communication. He believed that our language used to be much more rudimentary, and as it got more abstract, our reality changed, and the need for that inner voice kind of faded away for whatever reason. But what's important here is that, again, we're told that language changes our consciousness. It changes our reality. And as our ancestors told us through the story of the ancient matrix, our Creator manifested everything through language, through the spoken word, through the Om vibration. So language is important. Narratives are important. What we tell ourselves and what we are indoctrinated is very important. And an example of that would be money. Money and it is a language per se. Money doesn't actually exist. We created money and the money system. It's just paper, but it's a language, a contextual reality, a reality tunnel that we use to toggle with each other and in central reality. And so we can come up with all kinds of different systems and ways to live. It's just all is based off of what we tell ourselves and each other. And with that, we have an interesting story told to us through Kabbalah, through mystical Judaism. And in a story known as the Shavira, the breaking of vessels, we are told that the Ein Sof, the unknowable light, God, created a universe before this one. And in that universe, Ein Sof attempted to put a part of itself in all of its creations. But that light was too powerful, and everything shattered and exploded. So that entire universe exploded. And so in the second universe, the one that we are currently in, Ein Sof had to commit what is known as Tzimtzum, self-limitation. So it had to draw back some of its power and only put a little bit of it in everything so that we could live, so that we could be sustained without exploding. And so that would explain why God is seemingly nowhere, yet kind of everywhere all at once. And it's also kind of an allegory to me as to how our Creator had to draw itself back and had to allow us to slowly develop and slowly upgrade to the point where eventually we'll be able to receive its full light, receive in full what it is and who we really are. We're not ready for that. So we're slowly being prepared for that moment of singularity, if you will, when we'll finally be ready to accept what this all really is and who we really are.
Awesome.
And the Matrix directly drew from this when Agent Smith said the first reality was, wonderful and everybody loved it, and it blew up. It didn't last.
Wow. Yeah. Somebody was reading the Kabbalah, huh?
Yep.
So with that, we have the matrix energy grid work, or there you go, the word matrix. But so that was consciousness. We just went over consciousness, and we'll get back to that and how consciousness is powerful and our mind is powerful. But we also have the physical world around us, right? This actual reality we live in. And this physical world that we live in is sustained and operates from the matrix energy grid work, as I call it in the book. And the matrix energy grid work is comprised of the four forces, the four fundamental forces that we went over, and the theoretical fifth force, the unified field, which, as we're now starting to realize, is consciousness, which is consciousness. And the matrix energy grid work, I believe, our Creator gave to us to eventually tap into so that we can become powerful and capable of some awesome things. And we're starting to see with all these UFO videos and UFO disclosure that it's possible. Because these UFOs that we've been witnessing for centuries or even thousands of years have seemingly found a way to tap into the matrix energy grid work. They've been able to tap into the etheric forces that exist around us and use them as energy fuel sources. And the matrix energy grid work expands all throughout the universe. It's a sea of information. It's a sea of energy and ether. And if we were to be able to tap into that, it would be like building a boat that runs off of water. So as it sails through the water, it is continuously energized by the water that it sails through. And the quote that I have on the screen here is a quote from one of the Navy pilots who witnessed that famous Tic Tac video that was all over the news. And as he was saying, whatever it was defying the laws of gravity. But we've known about this and we've been studying this secretly, the governments at least, and the military-industrial complex. They've been studying this since at least the 50s. And the study of anti-gravity and the matrix energy grid work all goes back to, again, the 50s and starts with George S. Trimble. George S. Trimble was the founder of RIAS, the Research Institute for Advanced Study. And in the 50s, he put together a team of some of the nation's leading scientists to study anti-gravity. And this is still reflected in a New York Herald Tribune article in 1956 that you can go find. And in that article, it stated again that, Trimble was putting together the top scientists to study anti-gravity, this, and that. But the interesting thing is that RIAS eventually merged into what is now the famous Lockheed Martin back in 1995. And Lockheed Martin is the now infamous institute or company that's behind a lot of like strange UFO reverse engineering projects and stuff like that. And Ben Rich, who was a former head of Lockheed Martin, is the guy who famously stated that we now have the technology to bring ET back home. And Harry
Skunkworks. He was the head of Skunkworks.
Absolutely. Skunkworks is a branch of Lockheed Martin. Right. Yeah. And
still exists.
Yep. Harry Reid, former senator and Democratic leader, also believed that Lockheed Martin had a crashed UFO or alien craft in its possession, and was adamant about that and would publicly state that on multiple occasions. And Clarence Kelly Johnson, founder of Skunkworks, interviewed Ben Rich, who was famous for the ET comment, on UFOs and asked him, how do UFOs work? How are they working? And how are they defying the laws of gravity? And Ben Rich replied that they work in the same way that ESP does, in the sense that all points in the universe are connected. So there's a unified field that connects everything in the universe. And that's how these UFOs are defying the laws of gravity. And so scientists, again, have been trying to find what this unified field is, what this fifth force is. And we're starting to realize that unified field is consciousness itself. And this has been studied by the military-industrial complex, again, since the 50s at least. And in a paper by NASA from the 70s titled Field Resonance Propulsion Concept, which you can go find, they speak about this, saying that, we could technically tap into the unified field, the four forces, and if we could achieve space-time travel, from here to the other side of the universe. And in a paper more recently in 2011 by the Defense Intelligence Agency titled Quantum Tomography of Negative Energy States in the Vacuum, we are told the same thing. These scientists put the paper together were explaining that, if we could tap into these matrix energy grid works, we could have a fuel source, a self-renewing fuel source that could allow for great power, Of course, all these guys want it for weapons and defenses and stuff like that. But I think our Creator intended for us to find these grid works and to be able to tap into them eventually with our consciousness, which
reality
is the true
bomb.
Yeah. And Nikola Tesla thought this as well, and he knew this, and he thought of us as a spiritual machine as well. In the quote that I have on the screen, he called us the little engine of inconceivable delicacy and complexity of construction, unlike any on Earth, which is hitched to the wheelwork of the universe. So to Tesla, we were little engines, we were spiritual machines. And he believed that it was in our destiny to tame nature, to tame the forces of nature and utilize them to, our wildest desires and dreams. And he believed that there was an underlying force that connected everything. And he called that the luminiferous ether. And he likened that to the Hindu Akasha, where the Akashic records come from. And he believed that at the underlying force of everything was that internet, and that we could tap into it. And in a speech that he gave in 1938, about 5 years before he died, he claimed to have come up with two fascinating discoveries. And he didn't tell us exactly what they were because he was still working on them, but he hinted at what they were. And in those two discoveries, he says that one of them had to do with gravity. And he claimed that his discovery having to do with gravity would shatter all the known theories of gravity. And the other theory that he had discovered, or the fact that he had discovered, had to do with all of the matter of the physical world, going down to the smallest structure to the biggest structure. And he was very excited about this, but again, he passed away about 5 years later, so we never got to find out exactly what he meant. But we can deduce from what he already told us that what he discovered was probably that gravity, or the unified field, was consciousness. As he already stated, he knew that there was a luminiferous ether all around us, and that it was our destiny to tap into it. So we can probably assume that he realized what we're realizing now, that there is a unified field, and that unified field is consciousness. All right, so with that being said, there was a wonderful study that came out last year that proved the universe is not real. So they say. What they actually proved is that the universe is not locally real. And there were 3 scientists last year in 2022 who won a Nobel Prize in physics for proving that the universe is not locally real. Now, what that means is that Well, let's break this down a little bit. So, in physics and in quantum physics, we have the terms locality and non-locality. And locality basically equates to Einsteinian science. We're just a physical body, our brain produces consciousness, the end. That's locality. Non-locality states that consciousness is superior to physical matter and is actually separate from physical matter, and that quantum entanglement and the properties of the quantum world can actually defy the laws of physics. That's non-locality. And they proved this to be true last year after they proved that quantum entanglement is real. Now, quantum entanglement is the phenomena of two particles creating a connection that can send information no matter how far apart in the universe they are. So that's quantum entanglement. It is a shared connection between two particles that can send information to and from each other no matter how far apart in the universe they are, faster than the speed of light. And Einstein refuted this in a famous paper back in 1935, now called the EPR paper, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paper. He refuted this and stated that quantum entanglement is impossible, and he famously called it spooky action at a distance. Smartest guy in the world. I don't know why he chose to call it that, but
we all make mistakes, right?
Yes, but last year, these three scientists who I speak about in my book finally proved that quantum entanglement is real, it is possible, which opens up the discussion for so many other things. Quantum entanglement theoretically means that telepathy is real, telekinesis could be real, teleportation could be real at some point, as long as we keep harnessing this science and uncovering it. Really, is what we're doing, is uncovering it. Again, I think our Creator designed this to be so, and wants us to uncover this, and wants us to upgrade eventually. And Jacobo Grimberg was another scientist who realized this too, actually back in the 70s. And I have a documentary on him on my YouTube channel if you want to check it out. Jacobo Grimberg was a scientist from Mexico who studied in America, who founded a couple institutes in Mexico that studied consciousness in the brain and the mind. And he did an experiment back in the 70s or 80s where he had two people meditate together, basically trying to recreate quantum entanglement. He had two people meditate together face to face for 20 minutes. And after they meditated together, he separated them in two rooms. And he had one person wear an EEG, and that person who had the EEG was flashed with light. And as they were being flashed with light, the EEG was picking up the brain patterns. And one person was being flashed with lights, and another person had the EEG on. But basically, as he did that, as he had them separated in rooms, the person who was being flashed with the lights, or there was one person being flashed with lights, and the person in the other room, their brain was responding in the same way that the person who was being flashed with the lights was. So in other words, their brains were reacting similarly, or as if they were experiencing the same thing. And so what he realized was that their brains had made a connection through that meditation. And he believed that connection was made in what he called the pre-space structure. So he believed that this physical reality was a hologram, it was an illusion, and that there was an underlying reality, a source reality called the pre-space structure, where everything was encoded and programmed and then input into this reality, or played out in this reality. And he believed that pre-space structure is where the hyperfield existed. The hyperfield, in other words, is the source reality, Plato's essence, and that our brain and mind connected to the hyperfield, the pre-space structure, through what he called the neuronal field. So we have a connection to the pre-space structure and the hyperfield through our consciousness. So we interface here, but really we are residing in the pre-space structure. And
that's kind of obvious, right? Because where does the definition of protons, electrons, quarks, where does that all come from? It's not inside the physical universe. The thing that makes an electron everywhere has to reside somewhere and not here. Right?
Exactly. And that's what we're starting to realize. This reality is It's a small
Yeah.
dimension. Yeah, it's just one dimension, a part of the many others that are existing. And Jacobo Grinberg also talked about us being individual human conduits for the hyperfield, which is important to keep in mind as we start to talk about how consciousness is suppressed later on. So we are all individual conduits to the hyperfield. So there's a kind of a feedback loop system. Whatever the hyperfield or the main source program dictates to us, we ingest, and then we feed it back. So it creates a feedback loop system. So whoever controls the hyperfield or central reality controls what all of us download. But we can affect the hyperfield. If we start to wake up and start to change what we think, we can input that into the hyperfield and it gets fed back into us. So we'll get more into that, though, later on as I talk about how consciousness is suppressed. But with that, we have Project Gateway, which is a CIA paper that was put together in the 1980s, specifically titled The Analysis and Assessment of the Gateway Process, which I also have a documentary on. This paper was a summation of the work of Robert Monroe. And Robert Monroe was a radio broadcaster who realized that our brains can produce some very interesting things when they are hit with certain frequencies. And so we have two hemispheres in our brain, and each hemisphere responds to stimuli differently and also has different functions. But what he realized is if we meditate and harmonize our hemispheres through frequency meditation, then we can create some very powerful feats. For example, through hemisync, which is his technique, harmonizing the two hemispheres, we can induce astral projection, we can induce lucid dreaming, we can have out-of-body experiences and traverse the different dimensions that exist. And so again, I think it was our creator's intention for us to eventually do this. We have these different components of our physical body and our minds. This spiritual machine was meant to be utilized to do these things. And in this paper, Project Gateway, it is stated by the CIA, who put it together, that our universe is just one giant hologram. It's all one hologram that we are interfacing into from the other dimensions.
Or maybe a hologram of holograms, of holograms, of holograms.
Yeah, I think that there are reality tunnels. Again, like the central reality, the narratives that we're told, all these little spin-offs that the news tells us every day, they're all reality tunnels, within reality tunnels.
Right, exactly.
But with that, also in my book, I kind of detail just a little bit about the Chinese experiments on consciousness. And the Defense Intelligence Agency was actually monitoring some of the Chinese experiments back in the 70s. And the Chinese and Japanese experiments with consciousness started with a guy named Leping Zha. And he later helped found the Institute of Somatic Science of Yunnan in the 1980s, and which also later helped found the International Chinese Parapsychology Association in Hong Kong. And both of these institutes have conducted studies on consciousness, on ESP, and these different things. And one of the founding professors of these sciences over there, Yi Feng Chang, was conducting experiments with blind children. And he claims to have helped these blind children expand their consciousness to the point where they could see with touch. They could actually tell you what's on the paper, what color it is. And he claims that these children, through their strengthened consciousness, could talk to each other through telepathy. And he claims that he helped them achieve this through different meditation techniques, one of those being Qigong, one of the famous and ancient meditative techniques from that area. And he claims that all of this is possible. All of this was possible through his theory of the thought field. Again, this unified internet field that connects everything throughout our universe. All right, so now we're going to get into the reptilian brain network.
The juicy stuff, yes.
Hey, my ex-in-laws.
Hey, right? So again, we have the body, the mind, and both of those have their different components. And they're meant to be harmonized. They're meant to be utilized so that we can tap into these energy grid works around us to manifest at will and live our highest self. But we have the reptilian brain network that stops us from doing that. And the reptilian brain network is any organization, person, or even ourselves that basically keeps us trapped in the lower autonomic thinking. And one of those would be the archons, right? I don't need to explain who the archons are or Gnosticism or the
Not here.
Yeah, not here. You're all familiar with it. So we know what Gnosticism is and what they believed about our universe and how this universe is fake and it's ruled by the demiurge, and the demiurge had his gang of friends, the archons, right? And that the demiurge and the archons keep us trapped in the reincarnation samsara cycle, the soul cycling trap. And the archons are the rulers, right? Archon means ruler, right, or rulers. So anything that rules us in this life is an archon by definition. Mm-hmm. And so the reptilian brain network is a network of the archons. And I call it the reptilian brain network based off of the actual reptilian part of our brain. So we have what is called the R complex in our brain. And that was termed by Paul MacLean back in the 1950s in his triune brain theory. Mm-hmm. So in our brain, we have a part of it, the R complex, that is responsible for the instinctual traits, the more primal traits, sex, fear, fight or flight. That's what the R complex, the reptilian brain, takes care of. And also the reptilian brain is responsible for autonomic thinking. So whenever you're zoning out, like if you're driving home and you're zoning out or whatever, whenever you're in a zoned out state, your brain and mind are operating from the reptilian brain, the R complex. And the quickest way to evoke the reptilian brain is through the usage of fear. And so all around us, the reptilian brain network through the archons of the entertainment industry, the health industry, the governmental institutions, all these different things, they evoke it through all these different avenues by hitting us with subliminal messaging, sex, fear, competition, all these things that we see around us every day evoke our reptilian brain. And we're kept in that reptilian brain subtly. It's all around us, just very subtly enough to make us think that, we're operating independently when really we're consistently being kept in this subtle, low vibratory state of the R complex. And whenever we're stuck in the R complex, that autonomic thinking, we're not operating on higher levels. We're not ascending as our creator intended us to do so. Now, on the screen, I also have a couple bullet points having to do with Edward Bernays, who, again, was the father of public relations, who later on admitted in his book, Propaganda, that he was employed by the government to institute subliminal messaging to shape and shift the consciousness of the mass. And he stated that, yeah, this is very true, and it's used by our governments all the time. And the TV networks do this. And all of the TV networks today are all bought out and owned by about 6 major companies. And this is a blueprint that was followed from J.P. Morgan, who bought out all the major newspapers back in the day. And I have a documentary on my channel that covers all of that in more detail, titled The Committee of 300. So in that documentary, I detail the globalist philosophy and how it started with Cecil Rhodes and ended up all the way with Klaus Schwab in the World Economic Forum. So in that documentary, I detailed, how these guys went from taking us from an agricultural independent society to a now globalist interlocked network. But anyways, all of that is a part of the reptilian brain network that keeps us stuck in the archonic, low vibratory existence. When we're fed low quality reality, we lead a low quality existence. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And depression is another arm of the reptilian brain network. Depression is vast nowadays. 10% of Americans are depressed, clinically depressed. And since 2020, there's been a 25% increase worldwide in depression. And what we're realizing now is that depression is not just an emotion. When you go watch a movie and you get sad, that's an emotion. But we now realize that depression is is a part of what we call global states of consciousness. A global state of consciousness is a state of consciousness that alters your entire body and mind. An example of that would be a coma. When you're in a coma, you're in a global state of consciousness. Your entire body and mind are affected. And we're now realizing that depression is a global state of consciousness. When a person is depressed, their entire body, their entire anatomy and mind is altered and is now operating from a lower form. And so when you're depressed, it's almost as if you're walking around asleep. You're not able to operate on these higher levels. And so depression is an unseen force. We know it's real. We can see its effects, but it's an unseen force that grips our lives. And again, anything that rules us by definition is an archon. So by definition, depression is another archon. It's an archon. It's a part of the reptilian brain network. And all around us, depression is evoked by, again, the health industry that is corrupt, the entertainment industry, social media, all these different things. And in that CIA paper that I mentioned earlier, we're told in that paper that there exists lower vibratory energies, lower energy entities in these different dimensions. So that paper admits that these archons actually exist.
Oh, yeah.
Now with that, sure, life can be terrible. It's riddled with these different archons and all these things that are suppressing us on a day-to-day basis. But I think our Creator intended for us to struggle, and I believe that because it's apparent in nature. And I think that nature is God's direct expression. If you want to know what God thinks or expects of us, then all you have to do is examine nature, because nature is God's direct expression. And in nature, we see that God expects us to struggle. God expects us to evolve, upgrade, become better. And again, it goes back to that story of the Ein Sof and the breaking of vessels. God had to draw itself back so that we could exist, and so that we could slowly upgrade to the point where we will be ready to receive who we really are and what it really is. And in Eric Newman's book, The Origin and History of Consciousness from 1970, he also stated this, saying that, we have the privilege of having this higher form of consciousness, this self-realizing consciousness, and we need to, attend to that, nurture it. And so the more we use our mind, the closer we'll get to that point that our Creator intended for us. But the more that we're suppressed in the reptilian brain network and stay in that stagnant state of autonomic thinking, the less we'll be able to do that. So we need to keep utilizing our mind. We need to keep utilizing our consciousness and upgrading and elevating. And so ascending the program, how can we start to do that? There are very practical ways that we can actually start to ascend this program and break from the reptilian brain network. And it all starts with realizing that we're not just the body. It goes back to that mind illusion aspect. You need to first realize that you're not just the body. You are also the mind. You are two major parts, the body and the mind. You need to start with that. And then it gets deeper and deeper with the different functions of the body and the deeper functions of the mind. So it all starts with that. We need to harmonize the connection. We need to harmonize the connection between the mind and the body, which right now for most people is completely unharmonized and just running rampant. And one way we can start to harmonize the mind and body connection is through meditation. Just as Robert Monroe taught us through his hemisync techniques that are still available today. Actually, he has an institute, I believe, in Colorado that still teaches his techniques. So it starts with harmonizing the mind and the body. And we can do that through different meditation techniques. Some are better for other people or whatever. But it starts with sitting down and blocking out all these distractions and getting back into nature and getting back into yourself and simply listening to what's going on within you, meditating. It starts with that. And then slowly it starts with some more rigorous practices of actually eating healthy, actually thinking healthy, actually being healthy. And so Kundalini meditation is one example of this. It's one technique that can be used to do this. And Kundalini meditation has been going on for thousands of years. And in this meditation, we are taught about the Kundalini Shakti, the coiled serpent that resides at the base of our spine or right above our sexual organs, near the sacrum. And that coiled serpent is meant to be activated through the Kundalini meditation. And we're told by the ancients, when we properly activate the Kundalini Shakti, it'll extend outward throughout our body, through our spine system, and shoot through the crown chakra. And this is just a beautiful descriptive way of explaining it. We've now realized that what the ancients were trying to explain to us is that through meditative techniques of tapping into our body's operations, we can activate the healing properties that exist within us. For example, we have what is called the cerebral spinal fluid. We have a fluid channel that runs from our sacrum, the bottom of our spine, all the way up to our brain, around our brain, in our brain, and back downward. The cerebral spinal fluid is responsible for discarding bacteria and viruses, and also responsible for dispersing beneficial properties throughout our body and brain. And in the NIH's National Library of Medicine, there's an article on cerebral spinal fluid, and in that article it states that one way to activate it and get it moving and flowing properly is through yoga, through yoga and meditation. Because what yoga and meditation does, it helps open up the channels, open up your breathing, open up your arteries, open up all these things that are usually constrained and contracted due to the fast rat race that we live in. And so what the yogis were doing for thousands of years was activating these things, activating the cerebral spinal fluid, activating the healing properties within us. And another aspect of the Kundalini Shakti, apart from the cerebral spinal fluid, is the vagus nervous system. The vagus nervous system runs from the brain and outward to all the organs throughout the body. And the vagus nervous system is very important. It acts as an internet channel from our brain to our organs. So our organs speak to each other through the vagus nervous system. And the vagus nervous system helps calm the body. It can help calm it. It can help heal it. It has autonomic healing properties. Our body has autonomic healing properties. For example, the beating of the heart is autonomic. Our breathing is autonomic. And our healing is autonomic. When we get cut, our body automatically heals itself. And this is miraculous. It's a miraculous thing that we take for granted. So what the yogis were trying to do, and what we can do through meditation and through activating our body's functions, is heal at will, not just physically, but also emotionally and spiritually. We can actually theoretically get to the point where, at the extreme, we could cut our arm off, and through Kundalini Shakti and manifestation at will, grow our arm back. I mean, that is technically possible. Our body shows us that is possible. And I think
agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's our Creator's intention for us to reach that level of healing our body at will, taking control of our body's functions at will. And so, again, going back to that self-healing, and we realize this through different experiments. In my book, I go over an experiment that was conducted by Michael Levine. Michael Levine did some experiments on tadpoles. And what he realized was that growth patterns were being conducted by the body through bioelectricity. So when we cut ourselves and our skin grows back, it grows back through bioelectricity, the electricity and the energy that exists within us. And he realized that through working with tadpoles and larval salamanders. And he did this amazing experiment with that, where he took the electrical growth pattern of a tadpole's eye and then created an imprint image of that electrical growth pattern and then lasered it onto the embryo of a tadpole and actually had a tadpole grow an extra eye in its stomach.
Yeah.
So
you can
again,
see what his food is at the end of the day.
Yeah. He's like, oh, yeah.
I'm eating too many carbs, man.
I want to see those frogs, man. I try to find a picture of them, but I can't. I want to see those frogs with eyes
no
in their
kidding.
bellies. But the important thing is that, again, getting back to the codes, right? Like our growth patterns are coming from these bioelectrical codes, and we can tap into those codes, and we can take power. We can wield them through our willpower if we break through the reptilian brain network and start to take control of our bodies again by doing these practices. But with that comes generational trauma, and I'm just so you guys know, I'm getting ready to wrap this up. I know I've been going for what, like an hour and a half now.
Oh no, it's been great. People are loving it. The audience is engaged, man. Keep going.
No worries.
Yeah, no worries at all.
All right. Yeah, so with that self-healing, not just physically and emotionally, but it also comes with the spiritual healing of trauma, right? Because we inherit trauma, and that trauma can be damaging in many ways. And so for many, many years, scientists were trying to find the part of the brain that they thought stored memory, the theoretical engram, as they called it. And one of those scientists was Carl Lashley. He studied the brain and tried to find where memory was being stored for 30 years until he realized that memory was not being stored in the brain. We've now realized that memory is actually synonymous with consciousness. In other words, consciousness is what carries memory. And this gets back to Rupert Sheldrake's idea of the morphogenetic fields, the resonant field that is responsible for buzzing in and resonating cellular life, all physical life. And so if that is consciousness, right, if consciousness is that unified field that underlies everything and actually creates physical life, then with consciousness comes memories, and with the memories can come trauma. And we've realized through the metamorphosis of a butterfly as well that our memories and our minds can carry on after death. Because through the metamorphosis of a butterfly, the caterpillar is actually liquefied and broken down almost entirely in the cocoon. And as it crystallizes and forms into the butterfly, we've realized through experiments that it can actually retain memories that it had as a caterpillar, even after almost completely liquefying and breaking down. So that tells us that memory, consciousness, is not a physical phenomenon, but it's the other way around. And this is important, right? Because we pass on our traumas and stuff like that through our generations. And there could be collective conscious memories, collective subconscious traumas that we're passing on. And the reptilian brain network that keeps us trapped in this samsara cycle is passing on the collective subpsyche traumas and programs. And I go into more detail in my book about epigenetics and like the 100th monkey theory and stuff like that. But basically what we know is that traumas can be passed on through generations. And one professor, an example, Isabel Mansui, was doing experiments on this with mice. And what she realized is that when she deliberately traumatized mice, that traumatization could carry on to 2 or 3 generations, and that she would see that reenacted or reflected in their behaviors and in their health and stuff like that. But when she reversed it and treated the mice with utmost respect and gave them beautiful lives and all this and that as well was carried on into the other generations, and that these other generations of mice experience greater health, longer lifespans, and stuff like that. And Bruce Lipton who was a cell biologist, he also realized that genetics was not a physical thing, but that genetics, specifically, trauma in the genetics, was and behavior patterns that were coming from genetics were being passed on through the consciousness, through the memories, through the collective conscious experiences that humans were having. And so, again, memories is not a physical thing. Memories are a etherical conscious thing that get passed on through different lives and through different generations. And so we need to start healing ourselves physically, mentally, and emotionally, so that we can help ourselves, but so that we can also help pass on that vibratory energy onto the next generation. So as their birth through the morphogenetic fields, their programs inherit the beautiful and strengthened and heightened frequencies that we've obtained for them. And so with that, we have the famous quote, we're not human beings having a spiritual experience, but we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And that was told to us by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who I also have a documentary on. He was an interesting guy. He was actually a Jesuit mystic, really interesting dude. But he believed in this as well. He believed that there was a collective mind, and that through the collective mind, things can get passed on. Memories, collective programs can get passed on. But he also believed that through the individuation of consciousness, the self-realization that the yogis taught about, we could transcend death. Because what happens is as we die, as we transition, if we're not powerful enough in our self-realization, if we're not powerful enough in our consciousness, then it simply gets recycled back into the samsara cycle. And that's also part of the reason maybe why the reptilian brain network wants us to conform so much and not individuate. But in other words, the more we individuate, the more we tap into ourselves and our consciousness and build that connection with our minds, the easier it will be for us to transition after death. It's the same as going to sleep and falling into a dream. When you fall asleep and you go into a dream, you're not really thinking about, you're trying to stay awake through that process. You kind of just fall asleep, go to the dream. And when we're in that dream, a lot of times we forget who we are. We forget that we're even alive in this life here. It's the same thing. When we die, we just simply forget all of this because we haven't gone through the process of strengthening our mind and staying conscious through that entire process. But it is possible, and I think it was intended for us by our Creator. And so let's talk about the source. What does happen when we die? Do we go back to the source? What is source? Well, I think source, again, is the ancient matrix, those original three components, the mother, the cosmic ether, the father, if you will, the creator consciousness, and the child, which was the Om vibration, that manifestation at will that can create any physicality at will. But source can also be thought of as like the Akashic records, where infinity exists, where all things exist, where all information exists and is stored. But do we even want to go back? This is something that I've been thinking about more recently. I don't think it's necessary for us to go back to source. And I don't even think that we're privileged to go back to source. I don't think that just because we've lived a life as a good person on earth for close to 100 years, we get to go back to source. There are various dimensions. And so I think if anything, if we're even privileged enough to leave the samsara cycle, there are still other dimensions we have to deal with. Source is like the ultimate last thing. And I think that when we go back to source, that's when we've pretty much exhausted and tired ourselves as ascended beings and are ready to go back to source. And I think going back to source means completely absolving ourselves of our individuality and allowing ourselves to go back to the creator consciousness, to the ancient matrix, and allowing it to take us back in and do with us as it will. But I don't think our creator intends us to go back. I think our creator intends us to ascend this program first and play around with all the other dimensions and maybe create our own universes, create our own planets and stuff like that, But it all starts with going inward, going inward and committing what I call higher self retribution. When our creator manifested us, each one of us. It created us to be immortal, infinite. But when it created us, what happened is that when it created our higher self, our lower selves were also created, incidentally, I believe. Our higher self is existing in source or near source. And our lower self, our avatar self, who we are right now, was incidentally created. But then the even lower self, the shadow self, was also incidentally created. And so what I think is that in order to get back to our higher self, we have to reconcile all of those selves. We have to reconcile our shadow self with our avatar self, which is who we are right now. And once those are reconciled, then we conjoin those to the highest frequency of who we are, our higher self. And once all three of those are reconciled and we've committed higher self retribution, then and only then can we have the true conscious expansion and awareness of knowing past, present, and future, and then receiving what our Creator intended for us, which is knowing exactly who and what we are and who and what it is. And so with that, we have the crystal lattice mind illusion. That is the presentation.
Oh, that was brilliant. Thank you.
good.
Bravo. Yeah, bravo. Bravo, senor. Muy bien.